Hello, welcome back. So now we know what ABC is. We know when a company might need it. So what are the steps to establish an ABC system for a company? So the first step is to identify the activities performed in the manufacturing process that generate overhead costs. So usually what happens is you have like the production manager and the CFO tour the manufacturing plant, and they walk through the entire process, and everywhere they see an overhead cost occurring, they write it down. So if we go back to this example we had for the glove manufacturer, right? Every time we see an overhead cost occurring in this manufacturing process, right? We requisition the materials, we make the gloves, we finish the gloves. So what's happening while we're making the gloves? Well, if we're making colored gloves, we have to stop and pump dye into the machine. That's a cost. So the CFO and the plant manager would see, okay, that's an activity that's happening right now in the manufacturing process. That activity creates a cost. So that's why it's the first step is what are all the activities that are generating overhead costs? And you would simply make a list of all them. So in this example, the first activity that we'd identify is shutting down the machines for pumping in the dye. So pumping in the dye. So that might be the first activity that we identify as we're walking through the manufacturing plant looking at colored gloves being made. The next would be after the manufacturing process, it looks like these machines have to be cleaned. That's a cost. Cleaning of the machines. We have to pay workers to do that, right? So that's a cost. Next, we have to run additional materials through the machine to get the residue out. So that's a cost. We have scrap materials that we are going to be running through the machines. So just by looking through this manufacturer's process, we've identified activities that create overhead costs. So identify the activities performed that generate overhead costs. Generate overhead costs. Okay, your book just says that first line, but just so you know what it means, you want to identify the activities that are generating a cost for the company. The second step to establish an activity-based costing system for a company is then group similar costs together. When you do this grouping, that's called forming an activity cost pool. So how would you group it? So if we go back to this one, we would look for what's similar. So the pumping the dye and the cleaning of the machines, that involves indirect labor. So you might go ahead and group those because the cost that they're generating is the same, indirect labor cost, right? So then you might call that one machine prep. Machine prep is the name of your cost pool, and it involves two activities. You group them because they have a similar, this is called a cost driver. Okay, and then the cost that's being generated here is indirect materials. If we don't have anything else to group it with, that is its own cost pool. Okay, so we're going to group similar activities that have the same cost driver into activity cost pools. That's the second step. The third is to calculate the activity rate for each cost pool. How do we calculate an activity rate? Such a good question. All right, so to calculate your activity rate, your formula is to take the cost pool that you identified in the previous step and divide it by the cost driver. The cost driver, as the name identifies, it's something that's responsible for increasing the cost associated with that pool. So if our indirect laborers spend more time putting in the dye or cleaning out the machine, that's driving the cost of that activity, right? The more hours. There's also in the book a list of common cost drivers for activity pools, so you can look through that. I think it's on page, I just saw it. Oh, I'm gonna find it now. Hang on, where did it go? Cost drivers on page 209. It has a list of cost pools and potential cost drivers. So as an example there, if we have customer service as a cost, what's going to potentially drive that? The number of returns that we have from customers. If we're having to clean a lot of equipment, what drives that? Square footage could be a good cost driver. The bigger our facility, the more equipment. So something that's driving that cost. And that was on page 299. So that's your formula to calculate the activity rate. Step 4. We're then going to use that rate to allocate overhead to your products. How do we do that? This formula will look familiar. You're going to take the activity rate from the previous step and you're going to multiply it by the amount of activity used or consumed. So it kind of looks like your POHR formula, right? We're coming up with a rate. Before it was the predetermined overhead rate. Now it's an activity rate. And then we're taking that rate and we're multiplying it by an actual level of activity. So these formulas are the same as you had last 2 chapters. The only tiresome thing is you're going to have an activity rate for every activity cost pool. You could have 2, you could have 30, you could have 60, right? You can have a lot of cost pools. Each one's going to have its own rate and its own overhead cost. So that's where it gets to be tiresome, but we did say it was a more accurate program, and this is why. And then finally, the 5th step is to calculate your total unit product cost. If you remember what your product cost is, DM, DL, and MO. Now this MO comes from, this is overhead assigned, comes from the overhead that you assigned using your activity rate. So those are the 5 steps for creating an ABC system for a manufacturer. We will go over this with a problem so you can actually see the numbers get crunched. So go ahead and download the cart code data exercise, and then we'll work through that in the next video.